Summer settled heavily over Pennsylvania, wrapping the fields in a blanket of heat and stillness. 3 weeks had passed since little Thomas entered the world, and the Barrett farmhouse seemed transformed by his presence, his soft breaths, his tiny cries. The gentle rustling of blankets in the night, everything about him filled a house with a delicate, trembling joy. Yet beneath that joy ran an undercurrent of inevitability, a truth they could not ignore. Soon, they would have to leave. Eleanor spent her days in the rocking chair near the window, holding Thomas close against her chest. Her face, though pale from exhaustion, carried a peaceful glow. She hummed lullabies she remembered from childhood, songs her own mother had sung to her Aunt Martha. Eli would watch from a distance sometimes, struck by the tenderness of the scene, the fragile silhouette of the woman he loved, the tiny head nestled against her shoulder. He felt something fierce and protective rise in him every time he looked at them. But every evening, when the house grew quiet, the impending departure pressed into their hearts like a weight too heavy to bear. John and Martha knew the goodbye was coming, but they avoided speaking of it. They did not want to break the fragile peace that had settled between them. After so many months of turmoil, one warm afternoon, John stepped into the yard where Eli was tightening the straps on the old wooden trunk. The young man paused when he heard John's footsteps, his shoulders stiffening instinctively. "You'll need good rope for a journey like this," John said quietly. Eli nodded. "I'll make sure everything's secure." There was a long silence. John cleared his throat. "You're doing the right thing, Eli. Not because you have to go, but because they need a place where they won't be judged for simply existing." Eli swallowed hard. "I don't want to leave this home. You and Martha, you gave me a life. You raised me. I'll never forget that." John placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of affection from a man not given to softness. "You're a good man, and now you're a father. That means you go where your family needs you most." The simple words struck deep. Eli nodded, his throat tight. Inside the house, Martha was folding linens into a small travel chest. Eleanor sat nearby, watching her sister with misty eyes. "Take the trunk," Martha said softly. "Mother gave it to me when I married John. I want you to have it." Eleanor shook her head. "I couldn't. It belongs here, with you." "It belongs with family," Martha replied. "And you are family. You always will be." Eleanor felt tears burn behind her eyes. Martha approached her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I forgive you," she whispered. "Not because it was easy, but because love is rarely simple, and because you've never been happier than you are with Eli." Eleanor let out a slow, trembling breath. "You've always had the kindest heart." "Then do me one favor," Martha said. "Write to us. Let us know where life takes you." "I will," Eleanor promised. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the family gathered in the yard. John held the reins of the horse that would pull the cart. The bags and trunk were already loaded. The baby slept in Eleanor's arms, bundled in a soft cotton blanket. The goodbye came quietly, without theatrics, without raised voices, just the soft ache of parting. Martha embraced Eleanor tightly. "Take care of yourself, of him, of the baby." Eleanor's voice trembled. "Thank you for everything." John shook Ella's hand firmly. "You protect them, and if you ever need help, right? Welcome." Eli nodded. "I promise." He then climbed onto the cart, helping Eleanor up beside him. Thomas stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Eli brushed a hand over his son's tiny head. "Ready?" he asked Eleanor. She nodded, though her eyes glistened. With a gentle snap of the reins, the horse began to move. The wheels creaked softly over the dirt road. Martha lifted her hand in one last wavering wave, John standing silently at her side. As the cart rolled toward the fading horizon, the Barrett farmhouse grew smaller behind them, its windows glowing faintly in the dusk. Eli wrapped his arm around Eleanor, pulling her close as the night breeze brushed against them. They didn't know what awaited them in the small town near Pittsburgh. They didn't know if life would be kind or harsh. They didn't know if the world would ever understand their love. But they knew one thing. Wherever they went, they would face it together. A woman and a young man bound by love that defied every rule. And the child whose life would carry their story into the future. The small town outside Pittsburgh welcomed them with a kind of quiet indifference that, for a while, felt like mercy. People came and went along the dusty main street without stopping to stare. No one asked questions when Eli inquired about work. No one looked twice at the older woman stepping carefully off the wagon, holding a newborn against her chest. It was a place where railroad workers, factory men, widows, migrants, And wanderers crossed paths daily, each carrying their own hidden stories, and so their presence caused no ripple at all. Eli found work almost immediately. He hauled grain sacks at the mill, stacked lumber at the rail yard, and swept floors in the general store when extra hands were needed. The wages were small, but steady. Every evening he returned home tired, his shirt soaked in sweat, his shoulders aching. Yet he always paused at the doorway to catch the same sight: Eleanor rocking gently in the worn wooden chair, the baby cradled in her arms, the golden lamplight softening the room around them. Thomas grew quickly. By his 3rd month, he watched the world with wide, curious eyes. By his 6th, he laughed often, reaching for Ella's fingers, clutching at Eleanor's scarf, babbling nonsense that filled the little rented house with joy. He was a quiet baby, but intensely observant, with a seriousness that felt almost uncanny, as though he studied every face, every sound, every moment. Eleanor, too, seemed to bloom in those early months. Despite her age, despite the exhaustion that clung to her bones, there was a youthful glow in her expression whenever she looked at her son. She sewed little shirts for him, embroidered tiny birds along the collars, hummed lullabies as she bathed him in a small tin basin. The neighbors, seeing her through the open window, sometimes smiled and called out kind greetings. Few asked personal questions. Those who did assumed Thomas was her grandchild. Eleanor did not correct them, but peace, even fragile peace, never lasts forever. It started with a simple exchange at the market. Eleanor had taken Thomas with her to buy vegetables, bundled snugly in a blanket against the chilly autumn air. As she weighed potatoes, the shopkeeper smiled and said, "Your grandson is a handsome little fellow." Eleanor hesitated. Something flickered across her face in an instinct, a shadow, but she forced a polite smile. "Thank you." But the woman beside her tilted her head. "Grandson? I thought he was your child," she said, not unkindly, only curious. "The young man you live with has the father, isn't he?" The question struck like ice. Eleanor's heart skipped painfully. Her fingers tightened around the small basket she carried. The shopkeeper frowned. "You mean Eli? He told us you were his wife." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Yes," she answered softly. "Yes, that's right." But the woman who had questioned her gave a long, thoughtful look, one that lingered a moment too long. As Eleanor left the market, her breath came unevenly, her mind racing. It had been so easy, so safe, so quiet, but all it took was one curious glance, one misplaced question, one person who looked too closely. That evening Eli found her staring out the window long after Thomas had fallen asleep. The lamp burned low beside her. "What happened today?" he asked gently. She hesitated before answering. "Someone asked questions. They noticed the age difference, they wonder. People aren't blind, Eli. They see." He knelt beside her. "We're honest people. We work hard. We hurt no one. If anyone asks..." She shook her head. "Small places thrive on whispers. Curiosity here may not be cruel yet, but cruelty begins with curiosity." Eli felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew she was right. Memories of their old town rose like ghosts, accusations whispered behind closed doors, letters arriving without names, neighbors whose smiles hid venom. Still, he reached for her hand. "We can face this together." For a time, things returned to calm, but the calm was different now. It felt thinner, as though stretched tightly over something waiting beneath. And then, one afternoon, Eleanor received the first letter. There was no name on the envelope, only a shaky scrawl. "People will learn the truth. You cannot hide forever." She sank into the chair, her breath leaving her in a cold rush. When Eli came home, she held the letter out to him with trembling fingers. His face hardened as he read it, anger, fear, and something darker stirring in him. Someone new, someone from their past, and someone was coming for their peace. The shadows had found them again. Winter crept into the little town near Pittsburgh with a slow, determined chill. The first frost came early that year, spreading across windows like delicate white lace, settling on rooftops, turning the fields pale and brittle. Inside their small rented home, Eleanor kept the stove burning from morning until night. Bundling Thomas in soft blankets while she moved cautiously through the cold rooms. Eli worked longer hours at the mill, coming home each evening dusted with sawdust and exhaustion. His hands cracked from the dry air. But even the warmth of the stove could not melt the new tension filling the home. The letter had shaken them deeply. The first anonymous message might have been dismissed as a cruel prank, a stray reminder from the past carried by coincidence. Yet Eleanor knew better. The handwriting, though shaky, felt too familiar. The tone sharp, accusing, felt like a ghost whispering directly into her ear. For days she hid the letter in a drawer, unable to bring herself to burn it. Sometimes she opened it in secret, reading the same few lines over and over until her hands trembled. "We know who she is. We know what you are. The truth will spread." One afternoon, while Eli was at work and Thomas napped in his cradle, another envelope arrived. This one was delivered by hand, left directly on their doorstep, the edges stiff with cold. Eleanor stared at it for long minutes, her breath uneven, as if simply touching it might unravel everything they had rebuilt. When she finally opened it, her heart clenched. The same handwriting, the same message, only colder. "You cannot silence the past. People deserve to know what kind of family lives among them." Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest, struggling to breathe. The fear she had kept buried since leaving Pennsylvania returned in a crushing wave. That evening Eli found her sitting motionless at the table, her face pale, the letter open in front of her. His expression hardened as he read it, a storm stirring behind his eyes. "This ends now," he whispered, his voice tight. "Whoever this is, they don't get to destroy our lives again." But he knew deep down that the past had a way of crawling back, no matter how many miles they had traveled. The worst came later that week. The pastor of the town's small church, a gentle, soft-spoken man named Reverend Hale, knocked on their door. Eleanor stiffened the moment she heard his voice through the thin wood. "Mrs. Carter," he called politely, "may I have a moment? I'd like to speak with you and your husband." Eli exchanged a tense look with her before opening the door. The pastor stepped in, brushing snow from his coat, his eyes kind but troubled. "Please understand," he began quietly, "this visit is not an accusation, but there have been questions." Eleanor felt the room spin. "Questions?" Eli repeated, his voice sharp. Reverend Hale sighed. "A few members of the congregation received letters, anonymous ones. They claim that your family is unusual." He hesitated. "That Mrs. Carter is much older than you, and that the child is hers." Ella's jaw clenched. Eleanor felt tears collect behind her eyes. The pastor continued gently, "I don't believe in passing judgment. I know many letters are sent out of malice, but I must consider the well-being of the community. People here talk, they whisper, and whispers have a way of becoming stories." He folded his hands. "I simply want to know if there is truth behind these claims. Are you two truly husband and wife?" Eleanor's breath caught painfully. Shame, old, deep, heavy, settled over her. Before she could answer, Eli stepped forward, his voice steady but wounded. "She is my wife. Thomas is our child. We don't owe anyone any more explanation than that." Reverend Hale held his gaze for a long moment, searching for anger or deceit, but he found neither, only fear, love, and a fierce determination. "I understand," the pastor said at last. "I will not spread rumors, but people will continue to talk. I fear it may become difficult for you to remain here." His words, though soft, struck like a hammer. After he left, Eleanor sat down slowly, hands trembling. "Eli," she whispered, "I can't run again. Not again. I'm tired. I'm so tired of being chased by things that should have died with the past." He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "If the world is against us, we'll build a new one, even if it's just the three of us." His voice steadied her, but fear still clung to her ribs like cold iron. For the next few days, whispers indeed spread, quiet conversations in the market, lingering glances on the street. People were not openly cruel, but their curiosity sharpened into suspicion. Work became harder for Eli to find. Neighbors became distant. One night, when a third anonymous letter appeared, this time tucked under the door of the local apothecary, Eli realized the truth. Whoever hunted them had not given up. And soon, the town wouldn't either. The rumors were back, and this time, they were growing roots. Winter tightened its grip on the small town with a harshness none of them had expected. The snow came early and fell often, piling in heavy drifts against the houses, turning the streets into narrow white corridors. Yet, even the silence of winter couldn't quiet the murmurs rising around them. The Barrett now Carter family found themselves under the familiar shadow of suspicion once more, and the walls that had once felt safe began to close in. Eli noticed the change first at the mill. Men who once greeted him with nods now avoided his eyes. A few whispered together when they thought he wasn't listening. His work hours were reduced with no explanation. One afternoon, when he overheard two workers muttering about that strange couple with the old wife and young husband, he knew the rumors were spreading faster than he could try to stop them. At home, Eleanor felt the shift too. When she took Thomas to the market, conversations hushed as she approached. A woman who had once admired Thomas' quiet nature now stared at him with uncertainty, as though the child carried something tainted. Eleanor walked home that day with the baby pressed tightly to her chest, her steps trembling. The final blow came when John Nacklin, the town's apothecary and their neighbor, knocked on their door one cold evening. His expression was grave. "Eli," he said gently, "I received a letter. The same kind folks have been whispering about. I don't hold it against you, but others will. People here don't forget things like this." He hesitated. "You're a good man, but this town is changing. And not in your favor." After he left, Eleanor sat by the stove, staring into the fire. Shadows danced across her face, emphasizing the fatigue that had settled in her eyes. "I can't keep running," she whispered. "My body, my heart, I don't know how many more times I can start over." Eli knelt beside her, his voice soft but firm. "We won't think about how many times, just what we must do now. You and Thomas come first. Always." She looked at him, the flickering firelight reflecting in her tired gaze. "Where do we go? What life is left for us?" Eli took her hand. "Somewhere far. Somewhere where people come and go, and no one asks who you were yesterday." But it was Eleanor who made the final decision. "We leave in the spring," she said quietly, "when the snow melts." Before the whispers turned into something worse, the plan settled over the house like a somber blanket. There were no dramatic tears, no shouted arguments, just a quiet, aching acceptance. For them, leaving had become a bitter necessity. As February turned to March, they prepared quietly, packing only what they needed. Clothing, a few blankets, the cradle Eli had built, and the small wooden chest Martha had gifted them. The rest of their belongings were sold for a few dollars or given to neighbors, who asked no questions. By the time the thaw came, slow, muddy, and reluctant, the decision was final. Early one morning, with the ground still firm from the cold night, Eli hitched the borrowed horse to the cart. Eleanor wrapped Thomas tightly into blankets, kissing the top of his small head. The child, nearly 1 year old, blinked sleepily at the morning light, unaware of the world shifting beneath him. As they loaded the last trunk, several neighbors emerged from their doorways. Some watched silently, some whispered. One woman, Mrs. Hale, the pastor's wife, offered Eleanor a sad smile. "May you find peace wherever you go," she said softly. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Thank you." There was no farewell dinner, no final visit from friends. Their time in the town ended as quietly as it had begun, shadows lingering, hearts heavy, hope fragile. They set off westward, toward Ohio, toward railroad towns where no one knew their story, where families came from distant states, seeking work and refuge and anonymity. Hours passed in silence as the cart rolled along the muddy road. Eli held the reins tightly, guiding the horse through deep ruts. Eleanor sat beside him, Thomas sleeping in her arms. The wind was cold, but it carried a faint promise of spring. "We'll be all right," Eli murmured eventually, more to reassure her than himself. Eleanor leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "We have to be," she whispered, "for him." Behind them, the town faded into a blur, a distant chapter closing quietly. Ahead of them stretched uncertainty, vast and endless, like the plains they would soon cross. For the third time, they left behind a life they had tried so hard to build. But this time, as the road unfolded before them, they carried something they hadn't before. Not just fear, but hope, thin, trembling, but alive. Ohio became their home slowly, the way a seed becomes a tree, quietly at first, then surely, taking root deep beneath the soil. The railroad town where they settled was a place of noise, grit, and constant movement. Trains screeched at all hours, workers shouted across the yards, and so drifted lazily through the air. Yet somehow, amidst the din, the town offered something they desperately needed: anonymity. People here arrived with pasts they never spoke of. Some had fled debts, others failed marriages, others heartbreaks too sharp to name. Nobody asked who you were before. They only cared whether you worked hard and paid your bills. In such a place, the Carter family finally exhaled. Eli found steady work repairing tracks and hauling materials along the line. It was dangerous labor, noisy, blistering, brutal, but it paid enough to keep them alive. Each evening he returned covered in dust, his muscles aching, but with a rare sense of purpose etched on his face. Eleanor sewed clothes for neighbors, earning a few coins at a time. Her hands were slower now, her breathing sometimes strained, but the familiar rhythm of needle and thread soothed her. And Thomas grew like sunlight breaking through clouds. By the time he turned 4, he had become the bright center of their small world. He walked with a careful, deliberate stride, as if weighing each step. His dark eyes were thoughtful, always observing, always absorbing. He watched people intently, often in silence, and seemed to understand far more than his age allowed. Eleanor adored him with a tenderness that surprised even herself. She read to him from old books she had carried all the way from Pennsylvania, her voice cracking sometimes, but always warm. She told him stories from her youth, though she softened the details, skipping over the loneliness and lingering to long on the gentle moments. Sometimes, while watching Thomas play near the doorway, Eleanor would whisper to Eli, "He is your smile," and Eli would reply softly, "He is your eyes." Strong and wise, their quiet life might have continued undisturbed for years if not for the natural curiosity of a growing child. One evening, after a long day of work, Eli walked into the house to find Thomas sitting at the small wooden table, his small brow furrowed in concentration as he drew shapes on a scrap of paper. Eleanor was folding laundry nearby. Thomas looked up suddenly. "Papa," he said, "why is Mama so much older than the other mothers?" The question sliced through the room like a blade. Eleanor froze mid-fold, her breath catching. Eli felt his heart jolt painfully. He had known the day would come, of course he had. But hearing the question spoken aloud shattered something inside him. He knelt beside Thomas. "Why do you ask, son?" Thomas shrugged, his expression earnest. "At church today, a boy asked me if she was my grandmother. I said no, she's my mama." And he laughed. Why did he laugh? Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Her eyes glossed with tears. She tried to blink away. Eli swallowed hard. "People don't always understand our family, Thomas. But that doesn't mean our family is wrong." Thomas blinked slowly. "But why is she older?" Eli hesitated. His voice was gentle when he finally spoke. "Because people fall in love for many reasons, and not all families look the same." Thomas accepted the answer with the calm seriousness that defined him, but the question lingered in the air long after bedtime. Later that night, after the lamps were extinguished and the house rested in darkness, Eleanor stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the faint glow of moonlight. "He's growing," she whispered. "Soon he'll see everything for what it is. Soon he'll ask again, and he'll need more than simple answers." Eli moved behind her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "We will tell him the truth, when he's old enough to understand it fully." She shook her head. "And what if the truth breaks something in him? What if he can't bear it?" Eli exhaled slowly, resting his forehead against the top of her head. "The truth may hurt for a moment, but lies hurt forever." Her fingers curled against the windowsill. "I just want him to have a life unshadowed by our past." "He will," Eli said, "because he is ours. And he is strong." But fate, as always, was already moving. 2 months later, as Eleanor sold a basket of mended clothes at the market, she noticed a stranger, a traveling merchant, studying her from across the stall. His expression shifted slowly from curiosity to recognition. Cold recognition. He said nothing. He didn't need to. That evening, whispers began to stir in the marketplace. A rumor resurfaced, soft at first, then louder. "She used to live back east. There was a scandal. The husband is young enough to be her." Eleanor felt the air tighten around her. The past had found their new home, and the shadows were gathering once more. The first whispers were faint, barely audible beneath the clatter of train wheels and the hum of daily life. A passing comment at the market, a curious glance from a neighbor, a question that lingered a little too long. For a time, Eleanor convinced herself it was coincidence, just the natural gossip that drifted through any small town. But deep in her chest, a cold, familiar dread unfurled. 2 weeks after the merchant's unsettling stare, the rumors became harder to ignore. At the bakery, the owner paused mid-sentence when Eleanor entered. In the church vestibule, a mother pulled her daughter closer as Eleanor walked by. Eli heard his co-workers whispering behind crates at the rail yard, their voices low but unmistakable. "Something odd about that family. The wife's too old, the child doesn't look like her. And that man barely more than a boy." When they arrived, Eli clenched his jaw and worked harder, hoping sweat and silence might drown the rumors. But silence never stopped poison. It only let it spread. One evening, Eleanor stood at the sink washing dishes, and 3 sharp knocks sounded at the door. Eli opened it to find 3 men from the town, the blacksmith, the grocer, and a rail worker standing in the dimming light. Their faces were stiff, their eyes cold. "Evening, Eli," the blacksmith said, though his tone was stripped of warmth. "We need a word." Eli stepped outside, closing the door behind him to shield Eleanor and Thomas from their stern gazes. The men positioned themselves in a half-circle, boots planted firmly in the dirt. "We've been hearing things," the grocer began, rubbing his chin. Things about you and your wife. Ella's pulse quickened. My family is my business. Not when it affects the town. The rail worker snapped. We got letters. Anonymous ones. Not the kind you ignore. Eli stiffened. That word letters stabbed into him like ice. The blacksmith crossed his arms. Rumor has it she ain't your wife. Rumor has it she's your kin. And that the child ain't right. Maybe it's all lies, but you're gonna tell us the truth now. The town deserves that. Ella's breath caught painfully. Rage burned at the back of his throat, but he forced it down. The truth is simple. We love each other. We hurt no one. That's all you need to know. The men exchanged dark looks. That ain't an answer, one muttered. Inside the house, Eleanor watched through the window, her heart pounding. She knew what was coming. She had seen this before too many times. Suspicion turning to accusation. Judgment turning to danger. She opened the door slowly and stepped outside. The men fell silent at the sight of her. She looked small in the fading light, her shoulders thin beneath her shawl, her face pale. Her breath shallow, but her eyes held a rare, quiet strength. If you want answers, Eleanor said softly, ask me. The blacksmith shifted, uncomfortably. Mom, we don't mean disrespect. Yes. Eleanor interrupted gently. You do, but ask anyway. The grocer cleared his throat. What were you to him before you left Pennsylvania? The night seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her trembling courage. When she opened them, she met the men's gazes without flinching. I was his aunt. A ripple of shock passed through the group. The rail worker stepped back as though struck. The blacksmith swore under his breath. I knew it, one hissed. I told you it was unnatural. Eli moved protectively to Eleanor's side. We built a life together. We harmed nobody. That don't matter. The grocer snapped. Folk don't accept this. And they never will. The blacksmith pointed toward the house. For the beau's sake, you best leave before folks get angry. There are some things this town won't look past. The words dropped like stones into the cold evening air. The men left without another word. Their footsteps faded down the road. Silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Inside the house, Thomas sat on the floor playing with wooden blocks, blissfully unaware of the storm outside. Eleanor sank into a chair, her hands trembling violently. Eli knelt before her, grief stretching across his face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I couldn't lie anymore. You didn't do anything wrong, Eli murmured, though fear not at him. But we cannot stay. If we wait, they'll turn on us. Eleanor nodded weakly. We must go. Tonight or tomorrow. Before the whispers become something worse. They packed in silence clothes, blankets, a few jars of preserved vegetables, the small tin of coins they had saved. Eleanor lifted Thomas into her arms, kissing his dark hair as tears slipped down her cheeks. Tired, Eli, she whispered. So tired of running. But for him I'll run one more time. Eli cupped her face gently. Not alone. Never alone. As dawn crept slowly over the horizon, they stood at the threshold of the house they had hoped would be their final refuge. The wind was cold. The road ahead, uncertain, but they stepped onto it anyway, because the world had pushed them to choose. Be judged, or disappear. And once again, they chose to disappear. They left Ohio before sunrise, on a morning so cold the air itself seemed to crack. Frost clung to the windows of the small house they had rented, turning the glass milky and opaque. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long moment, Thomas held tightly against her chest, as she took in the silent rooms one last time. No matter how temporary a home was meant to be, leaving it always carried the sting of failure. But this time, the sting was deeper. It felt like fleeing from the last place where hope had felt almost possible. Eli secured the final bundle onto the wagon, tightening the ropes with shaking hands. He looked older that morning, exhausted, stern, desperate to stay strong for the family he had vowed to protect. The early light glimmered faintly on the frost-covered fields, tainting the world in shades of blue and silver. Are you ready? He asked softly. Eleanor nodded. As ready as I can be. Eli lifted her into the wagon, wrapped an extra blanket around her shoulders, and settled Thomas beside her. Then he climbed onto the driver's seat and tucked the reins. With a soft click of his tongue, the horse began to move. The wheels creaked, breaking the quiet of the frozen morning. Behind them, Ohio drifted away like a fading dream. Their destination was far west Kansas, a place Eleanor had only heard about from books and travelers. A land of vast plains and scattered farms, where neighbors might live miles apart and where newcomers were too common to attract much suspicion. a place where people came to disappear into the horizon, swallowed by the wind and the wheat. The journey lasted weeks. Days were spent on long, empty roads where the sky stretched endlessly above them, a pale dome of winter light. Nights brought biting cold. Eli kept the fire burning long after Eleanor and Thomas had fallen asleep, staring into the flames with weary eyes, listening for footsteps, for distant voices, for any sign that their past might still be following. But the only sounds were the crackle of fire and the lonely howl of prairie winds. Despite the hardship, the plains brought a strange comfort. There were no prying eyes, no whispered conversations behind shuttered windows, just the soft sway of tall grass and the quiet rhythm of travel. Thomas, now old enough to form words and questions, often pointed at passing cattle or distant birds, dabbling excitedly. His small voice reminded them that even in fear, life still pulsed forward. Eleanor's health wavered. Some mornings she seemed lighter, her smile genuine, as she watched Thomas clutch her finger and laugh. Other days she felt cold deep in her bones, her breath shallow, her face pale beneath her wear-upon shawl. Still, she never complained. Not once. She simply held her son close and pressed forward. By early spring, they reached a small settlement on the outskirts of Kansas, a cluster of weather-beaten houses, a single general store, a schoolhouse, and a narrow road cutting straight through fields that stretched to the horizon. It wasn't beautiful, not in the ordinary sense, but something about its plainness felt like safety. They rented a small house, a lopsided structure with peeling white paint and a roof that groaned in the wind. But it had space, a fireplace, and land enough for a small garden. For the first time in months, they felt the faint trace of calm. Eli found work at the railroad repair yard 2 towns over. The pay was meager, but steady. Eleanor sewed again, mending curtains for neighbors, stitching patches onto worn jackets, crafting little children's clothes. The people here weren't particularly warm, but they weren't curious either. They nodded when spoken to and minded their own affairs. Exactly what the Carters needed. Thomas flourished. He toddled across the yard with bright eyes, chasing grasshoppers, picking dandelions, laughing at the rustling leaves. Eli built him a small wooden horse, carved by candlelight. Eleanor kept a journal by her bed, writing short observations about Thomas each night, his new words, his habits, the expressions that reminded her of Eli. But time, relentless as ever, left its mark. One cold evening, while Thomas slept curled against a quilt, Eleanor sat in her rocking chair by the fire. Her breaths were shallow, her hands trembling. Eli knelt beside her instantly. "I'm just tired," she whispered, brushing a weak smile across her lips. "But listen, if something happens to me, promise you'll tell him. One day, when he's grown, tell him everything." Ella's throat tightened painfully. "Don't say that. You'll be here. You'll see him grow." She shook her head, her silver hair catching the firelight like threads of moonlight. "I have lived long, Eli. I have run far. But my heart, my body, they are tired. If the end comes, let it come softly." He pressed his forehead to her hands, fighting tears. "I love you," he whispered. "And I have loved you," she breathed, closing her eyes. Beyond fear, beyond judgment, beyond time. She passed quietly that night, her hand in Ella's, her face peaceful, her breathing fading like the slow dimming of an ember. They buried her beneath the old elm behind the house, the tallest tree on the property, where the wind sang softly through its branches. Eli carved her name into the trunk with a trembling hand. Life went on, because it had to. Thomas grew strong and curious, carrying his mother's wisdom and his father's determination. Eli worked the land, raising his son with fierce devotion. Years later, when Thomas was old enough to understand, Eli sat beside him under the elm and told him the truth. All of it. Thomas listened without flinching. When Eli finished, Thomas placed a steady hand on his father's arm and said quietly, "She loved you, and you loved her. That's all that matters." And in that moment, under the endless Kansas sky, with the wind whispering through the leaves, Eli finally felt the long, brutal journey settle into peace. A peace they had fought for. A peace they had earned. A peace born from the love the world never understood, but which endured anyway. The story ended where love remained.